my dad's family, my grandfather, his father, came to the States first in the 1930s, and he served in the military, in the US military, in the army, and then he opened a Chinese laundry, a Chinese hand laundry in the Bronx. And in the late 1940s, he was thus able to bring my dad and his older brother over from China um, to live with him in the Bronx. And so my dad was about 8 or 9. And when he was 16, he was diagnosed with leprosy, um, Hansen's disease, otherwise known as leprosy. And he was sent to the Federal Institution for the Treatment of Leprosy in Carville, Louisiana. That was the only one that was stateside. The other one was in Molokai in Hawaii. So he was sent to Louisiana, partly for financial reasons, but also partly for um, reasons of stigma. The disease is so terribly stigmatized, as it still is today, which is amazing considering how easily it's treated and how non-communicable it is. 95% of the human population is naturally immune. So he was there from the age of 16 in 1954 until 1963, which is far longer than my character Victor. Um, but it was a very formative time for him. And I think it very much shaped the person he became.
It almost functions in a way because Carville at its peak, which is when your father was there at mid-century, was what, 500 patients? Something like
Yes.
that. This was not
Yeah.
a small operation. This was a big operation that functioned in essence as a kind of community. And I mean, this is kind of a loose comparison, but it's almost like a boarding school in a way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that was my first impression of it when I went there for the first time, which was that it felt more like a prep school or like a liberal arts college than like a leprosarium or an institution. It's laid out very much like a prep school or a college. It's incredibly beautiful. It's on the banks of the Mississippi, and it's, you know, 450 acres, and it's incredibly verdant and beautifully landscaped. And you have these Victorian buildings. It was a sugar plantation, so the plantation house, the big house, is still there. So it has this incredible beauty to it. Live oaks that are a couple of 100 years old with Spanish moss, pecan trees. I actually gathered a whole bunch of pecans because it was pecan season last month when I was in Louisiana, and I gathered a whole bunch to bring back to my dad. They're in my kitchen right now, actually. Yeah, but it's an astonishingly, hauntingly beautiful place. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It does seem like a prep school, and it was also a really radical and progressive place, especially in the 1950s, and a really astonishing place for the fact that it was almost like a microcosm of America. There were people there from all walks of life, from all over the country. You had people who were illiterate, and you had people who had been socialites. So you have this incredible mix, not just of different ethnicities, but you have a mix of different classes as well.
Right. Well, that's the thing about a disease is that it has a kind of flattening effect when it comes to those sorts of hierarchies because it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't just pick on people from lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. It can you can get Hansen's disease when you're a socialite, as it turns out. So, from you say how radical it was, particularly in light of its time. It was also really radical in light of its place, because I guess now is as good a time as any to let listeners in on the big reveal, which is that my mother's maiden name is Carville. That is part of my family line, and that is the place from which my matrilineal line hails, that little town on the banks of the Mississippi. Yeah, I mean, this is a total weird synchronicity
Yeah.
that made me definitely want to talk to you about this book because it speaks to my own personal history. I never spent much time in Carville per se, but I was always told about what my family referred to as the leprosarium,
Mm.
because that is the distinguishing characteristic of that town, right? It's not a big place. I mean, the treatment center there is sort of the main event, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Unless something else is there now.
Well, I mean, now it's occupied mostly by the National Guard. Um, which is interesting because the last time I was there, I had to get clearance to shoot video on my iPhone. So I had to email like 6 different people to get security clearance. So it's used mostly by the National Guard. There is a museum there, which is beautifully curated by really single-handedly by a woman named Elizabeth Scheck Snyder, who has become almost like a family member. You know, she helped me so much with this book. Yeah, and that's basically what's there now because all of the last patients have passed on, the people who had lived there, and before they passed, they had already moved to Baton Rouge to like a nursing home type situation, and the Research Institute also moved to Baton Rouge. So
Okay. So just weird. It's just strange to me that this intersection would happen. And you talk about how Hansen's disease is not super communicable because 95% of human beings have a natural immunity to it. So 5% of the population is susceptible. Your dad was one of them. He gets sick. Can you just talk about the need for a place like Carville? There is such a stigma attached to leprosy/Hansen's disease. Certain cultures believe it's a kind of curse from the gods or proof that you were horrible in a past life or punishment for something or other, sexual deviance, that kind of thing. But if the disease is not communicable, why the need for like this isolated community and this kind of separation from the rest of society?
I mean, it wasn't for scientific reasons, it was for political reasons to assuage the incredible fear and panic that leprosy seems to cause among the public. It's also a testament, actually, like on the plus side, it's a testament to federally funded medicine, right? Because some of the treatment, for example, the surgeries that were done there to repair nerve damage, which my dad also benefited from, those would have been incredibly expensive, um, you know, in a regular hospital, which was another reason that my grandfather chose to send my dad, and, you know, that my dad also acquiesced to going. But in terms of the need for the place, maybe in a way, it was to protect the patients, you know, because there was so much um, stigma, and you know, we say the word stigma and it seems like just a word, you know, but really what it was people would be afraid to touch you, disgusted by you. You couldn't get a job, you couldn't get married, you couldn't, you know, navigate society at all. So in a sense, a place like that afforded sufferers a life, you know, a productive, functional life. And for people like my dad, who had come from essentially poverty, it afforded them a kind of education that they would not have been able to access. You know, my dad would not have been able to have the piano lessons, the voice lessons, the composition lessons that he got for free at Carville had he stayed in the Bronx.
That's right. That's right. So it's like it's a weird, it's like this weird combination of twists of fate, right? It's like both positive and negative. It has this, I think maybe ultimately positive if you had to net it out, and you can feel free to disagree, but it seems like the strength that your dad and the character in the book, Victor, had to develop through these experiences and the relationships made and the education received maybe outweighed some of the negatives. Like, what's your take on that? And maybe I'm curious to know what your dad's take is on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so subjective, just like everything is. You know, you can parse out the objective facts, but the lived experience of people who were there, I think it's very, very diverse. My dad's take on it was that it was great for him, that it was, you know, apart from being so ill and suffering physically, it was an incredible experience. And it was not only what gave him music, which he still loves and he still plays the piano every day. Um, but apart from that, I think it really forged his sense of being an American and being a citizen and being very politically active. That was what was remarkable at that time in the 1950s. You know, my dad got there in 1954, which was right when Dr. Joe Hansen, who had been the medical officer in charge, essentially the director of the whole shebang. He was very beloved, and he had retired. And in fact, like the Lake Johansson, was named after him. He'd had it built for the patients. So he was very beloved because he had a very sort of communitarian sense of what he wanted the institution to be like. And he, was based on science. He was a proponent of patients essentially doing what they wanted. And he would give passes to them to take breaks, to go home, vacations, etc., because there was no reason for them not to. He was lenient, as it were. But in 1953, the year before my dad got there, he retired and a new guy came in, Dr. Gordon, who was the opposite. He reinstituted these really draconian rules. He tried to get patients to, for example, only wear hospital clothes. He cracked down on dancing, dating, people being able to cook in their own homes. He wanted to take away the cottages where married people lived. All sorts of very obnoxious things that the patients railed against. By that time, however, there had been formed a patients federation, which was, a very powerful community of people who had leverage, and that leverage came from the magazine, the Star magazine, that was written and published at Carville by Carville patients, and also because the de facto leader of this Patients Federation, Stanley Stein, who in the book is Herb Klein, he had connections. He was incredibly well connected, not just politically and in the publishing world and in the news world, but he was also connected to Hollywood folks. He was a closeted gay man who, in spite of the fact that he was heavily disabled, he was blind, he couldn't even read Braille because his fingers had become desensitized from the disease. He couldn't walk without a cane. He eventually wound up in a wheelchair. But he was so charming and so charismatic that he became pen pals initially with several Hollywood stars, including Tallulah Bankhead. And eventually they became legitimately very, very close friends. So he got all of these Hollywood people, including Marlon Brando, to help fight for the cause, to restore dignity essentially to the patients at Carville. So Dr. Gordon was the target, I suppose, at that time of the Patients Federation. They wanted to do something about him. They wanted to get him out, essentially. So in addition to leveraging their political power through the Star, they also had strikes, they had sit-ins, they had protest marches. And, you can imagine my dad as like a 16, 17-year-old kid being very excited by this. And he heavily participated, and he was one of Stanley's readers. So everything had to be read to him out loud because he couldn't read Braille, right? So eventually, after 3 years, the Patients Federation hired a lawyer, sent him to the Hill, also got a local congressman on their side to speak on their behalf. And after 3 years, they kicked him out. If you can imagine, in 1957, they were able to get the medical officer in charge out, which is remarkable if you think about it. I mean, a group of lepers.
Yeah, I
So
mean
I think this was a formative experience for my dad.
I was going to say, like that's got to be such a crucial part of the education that he received while he was there, and such a unique kind of education to receive anywhere, but in particular in South Louisiana in the mid 20th century.
Absolutely.
It-
And I will add that Carville was integrated at a time when, Louisiana and the South was segregated.
right, right.
Yeah.
So, and like the racial politics of that time and the way that you depict them in the book are fascinating because there is, I think, an openness and an acceptance and an integration happening within the walls at Carville that was unique. But there's also still like racism and racial bias that kind of comes to the fore at times. It's not a perfect picture by any stretch.
Certainly. Not utopian, but I would say that it was an argument for solidarity. I think, and like coalitionism, I think the achievement there was that people from very diverse backgrounds and very diverse ideologies were able to come together for the common good. You know, they had a single fight that they were going to fight together. So, you know, perhaps we can learn something from that.
I was going to say, is like maybe that's the key, to have one thing in common that you all really feel good about and passionate about, and the rest of it can kind of, I don't know, recede if you have something to sort of center yourselves around.
Having a common enemy, perhaps, is
That maybe that's it.
one of the linchpins, right?
Well, I got to say too, I was thinking about this as you were describing it earlier, that something that's troubled me about the South, I think this is changing, especially in recent years, but you know, the post-Civil War South and the existence of these plantations and the way that some of them have become kind of tourist destinations, and even places where there are things like brunch and like proms and I don't know if there's
And
proms, but
weddings, that's
weddings, like,
popular.
yeah, like plantation weddings. That's really gross. And
Yeah.
I feel relieved that a plantation house in a town that has some connection to my family was turned into this leprosarium, or into this healing
Right.
place, and into this kind of radical place of integration and, I don't know, political activism. Because that feels, if you're going to do anything other than level a plantation or make it into a kind of unsettling historical site or something where you have to really face the truth of the place, which some of them are becoming, I can't think of too many things that are better than to turn it into a federally funded hospital,
Right,
right?
right. But nonetheless, there was a barbed wire fence surrounding it. So it continued to be a place where people were incarcerated and
Right.
where they lost their agency and where they had to fight for it.
Right. Yeah, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
And before we go any further, too, I want to make sure that we understand the implications of Hansen's disease, because it's very rare, and it's not something that I think is in the public consciousness too much. And I think if people have any idea of what Hansen's disease entails, it's kind of a crude understanding or some like abstract idea of like sores on the skin, or, you know, like limbs falling off and things like that. You know,
Right.
there's those kinds of things that I think you pick up in bits and pieces if you're, you know, I'm Generation X. That was kind of my,
I'm Gen X too.
yeah. So you pick these things up, and to be like sort of, I don't know, it's like sort of gross to think back. There were like leper jokes. Like I
Right.
remember, do you remember Blanche Knott's Truly Tasteless joke books? I don't know if you remember those, but
No.
they used to sell them at Spencer Gifts. And so you can imagine like me as like a junior high boy. I remember those were like popular, all the boys, because they're just kind of gross jokes, but some of them were really inappropriate and would never fly today. And I remember there being in those books jokes about leprosy, which, you know, those
Sure.
would not fly today. So, but just so people are clear on what your father faced and what other patients at Carville faced, can we just talk about what Hansen's disease entails symptomatically?
Yeah, what it actually is. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's a bacteria, which is quite similar to tuberculosis, actually. And it's very easily treated, as I said, with antibiotics, and which were invented at Carville, which were discovered at Carville in 1941. So while it's very easily treatable, without treatment, it can quite severely and systemically damage the body. It's a disease of the nerves as well as of the skin. So, in the Bible, the Leviticus 13 bit of the Bible that really like is in service of the stigma around leprosy. That's the bit that says, you know, unclean, unclean, etc. There's a conflation actually of a lot of different skin diseases. So, you know, medical historians have generally all decided that leprosy in the Bible is not what actual medical leprosy is. So that's part of the distinction, I think, of calling it Hansen's disease as well. So what can happen is sores. That's one of the first things that happens, but it can affect the nerves and the extremities, especially. So the hands and the feet, and the fingers, the ears, the cartilage in the nose. And since it can become systemic, it can affect the lungs. It can affect the eyes. Stanley Stein was blinded as a result of that. Um, yeah, so it can do a lot of damage, but limbs do not fall off. What happens quite often actually is that because of insensitivity, people will get injured and then it becomes infected and they wind up having to have fingers or toes amputated.
So what I want to ask you about is the fact of your interest in writing a book about this place and this time and this illness, and to process your father's story in a book. Because there is, I think, in his memory of it and in his own kind of memory of himself, there's a mythological quality to
Oh,
the time
yes.
that he spent there. It was such a pivotal time in his life. And so the way that these things work, I think, oftentimes in families, is that these stories get handed down, and you grew up hearing about this place, right? And so then that mythology kind of becomes part of your own
Yes.
narrative. And it's a big experience and such a pivotal one for your family and for your life. And so I want to hear about that part of it,
Mhm.
kind of learning about your father's story and then sort of feeling it as your own, and then getting to the point where it was so important to you that you knew that you needed to write about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember a time when I didn't know about it. I'm an only child, and my dad is a chatty guy, and I was a very curious kid, and I'm still a curious adult. So I asked a lot of questions, asked a lot of follow up questions whenever he would bring up this place where he spent all these years. His best stories were always about Carville, and you're right about the mythologization of the place and the experience. It felt mythological to me, it felt magical, like Oz or Narnia. But there's a term in psychoanalysis called anemoia, which is the longing or nostalgia for a place that you've never been. So I absolutely had that about Carville, which is why whenever I go, and I've been there twice now, it very much feels like a homecoming in a strange way. Um, Although I suppose it's not strange at all, given the fact that in such an isolated place, there was a culture that was specific to Carville. And that is the culture from which my dad parented me, you know.
Right.
So I have a
And
sort of,
and, and I got to say, parented you in Brooklyn, right? You were not raised in
yes,
Louisiana. So
no,
your childhood was very much removed geographically from Carville, but culturally it found its way into the way that your dad raised you.
absolutely. And we had all these artifacts at my house from Carville. For example, we have a Bible that is in the church in Union Chapel at Carville. Even today, there's a stack of them. I saw them a few weeks ago. And, my father took piano lessons and composition lessons and voice lessons when he was at Carville, like my character Victor. And he took all of his music books with him. So we have all of his music books from Carville with the notes that his teacher wrote in the margins. And some of those books were the ones that he taught me piano with when I was a child. So there's this continuity. We actually almost have, I think we do have more things from Carville than we do from China. So, there's very much of a sense of lineage, I think, and kinship among people who are connected to the place. You know, on my first visit there aren't too many people left who know about the old days, right? And on my first visit there, I happened to have lunch. There's still a cafeteria that serves lunch there. had a great gumbo, actually. But so, my dad and I went and had lunch there because I was poking around in the archives and he was doing a 3 hour long oral history, which, God help the person who transcribed it. But yeah. Uh, but we sat down and there was a man who was about my age. His name was Anthony Sanchez Jr., and he happened to be one of the groundsmen, one of the maintenance people at Carville. And his father had been a maintenance man at Carville, and his grandfather had also been a maintenance man at Carville. So he grew up around Carville, around that mythology, although for him it was day to day life. He grew up around patients. He still remembers when patients lived there and he knew a number of them. So, it was very normalized for him. But I think the fact that, he was surrounded by these people from all over the country gave him a really big inner world, in spite of the fact that I don't think he's ever left the area, you know. And as we were talking, it felt like I was talking to, a distant cousin or something. There's definitely something about proximity to that community at that time that trickles down into the way people think and feel and inhabit the world.
So yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question to pose. Is I suppose your father does have some kind of Southern vibe after spending part. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, some of it got
Yes,
in there.
certain idioms certainly,
Like,
and when he's around people from the South, he'll slip into a little bit of maybe it's like a mirroring of the accent a little bit,
sure.
and I think the thing that he took away from Carville first and foremost was music, of course, but apart from that, it was that political activism, and that he's not afraid of institutions. He's not afraid of using the system. He loves a good lawsuit. He's not afraid to go out and protest. After he left Carville, he wanted to join the Peace Corps, but of course they get your medical records. So, he couldn't join the Peace Corps, but he joined VISTA, which is essentially the domestic Peace Corps. And he protested Vietnam. He marched for civil rights. He marched with me, against Iraq twice. He was down at Occupy Wall Street, much to my mother's chagrin. So I think this is very Carvillian in that sense, from that experience of kicking out Dr. Gordon. I think he learned that on a grassroots level, if you get together and you fight hard enough, you can make shit happen.
I love that. That makes me happy that that's part of the legacy of that place.
Mm,
That's super cool, super cool and inspiring. And how cool for you to have
yeah.
a father who had that set of experiences and who carried it forward and kind of taught you. I think it's valuable to have
Yeah.
some recognition of your own power politically when it comes to things like social justice.
Something that was wild though, when I was researching the book and when, I was on that first trip with my dad to Carville, which was his first time back in 53 years. But in the archive, I was looking for, oral histories that I could maybe um, get a sense of the language and the life of young people in the 50s. And I was also looking for narratives by other Chinese Americans because in the 1950s, 15% of the population of Carville was Chinese American, which is a really high number, it was a far larger number than Chinese Americans or even Asian Americans on the whole in the United States at large. So, one would think that there would have been some documentary evidence of their experiences. And I didn't find a single one. I couldn't find a single firsthand narrative by a Chinese American. So I don't know what the reason for that is. I don't know if they just, didn't want to participate, or if it was institutional neglect, or if it was something more nefarious. Don't know. But the fact remains that there was a hole in the historical record. And that made me feel even more like I needed to tell this story and to fill that.
Okay. So I read that you initially thought you might write a work of nonfiction, or there was some question around what form the book would take. And I read that Lydia Yuknovich, a past guest on this program, and a terrific author, had some impact on you in terms of getting you to the desk to write this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was very resistant to the idea of writing fiction. Before I wrote this book, I'd never even written a short story before. I was primarily a poet in terms of the creative writing world. I have two poetry collections, but before this novel. I also worked in comics, and still do. My husband and I have a small press that publishes graphic novels, socially conscious graphic novels. So, we've been doing that for 18 years. It's part of my background too. And my academic background is in sociology. So, I knew how to write a poem, I know how to make a comic, I know how to write a sociology paper, but I had no idea how to write a novel. And I didn't, for some reason, I had like a psychological barrier, I guess, around thinking that I had the chops to do so. It seemed very complex to me. And also because of the biographical and historical material, I thought that it kind of made the most sense to go at it as creative nonfiction, perhaps, even though that in itself was daunting too. But I went to a conference in Portland when I first moved there, and Lydia Yoknovich was there, and I listened to her talk about her latest book and stood in line to see her. And I sort of, in that way that Lydia has, this very disarming way, I started out talking really normally and then started blurting out my whole life story. Part of which was to, tell her about this story that my dad had very recently given me permission to write. And I was telling her that I didn't know what to do with it, that essentially I felt like I had bitten off more than I could chew, that I had too much material as well, because, my dad helped me get all of this archival stuff from the museum. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents, medical records, photographs, all of this stuff. And I didn't know how to organize it. I didn't know what the story would be, if that makes sense. I knew where it was going to be set. I knew when it was going to be set. I knew it was going to, focus on either my dad as an actual person, or as on a character that was very much based on my dad. I knew that, but I didn't know what would happen in the book. Right. So I asked her, what do you think I should do? And she told me that the story would tell me what it needed to be, and that I was the only person who could write it, and that I had to listen to the story. And that's what I did. And, with a lot of kicking and screaming and with a lot of, continued resistance for 2 or 3 years, I would say, hitting a lot of roadblocks in my attempts at creative nonfiction, and also kind of, spinning out into, you know, side stories and areas where I didn't actually have any documentary evidence. My imagination kind of took over around some of the side characters, in particular the Sam and Ruth story. There's a romance between my character Victor's father and a Jewish woman who lives across the street from his laundry in the Bronx. And I didn't know anything about that. I knew that my grandfather had a relationship with a woman who wasn't my grandmother, when he was separated from her for, over a decade in the States. But I didn't know anything else about her. I just, I'd heard whispers about her existence. But for some reason, that story compelled me so much. The idea of, what could bring two people like this together and keep them together for years? What could be the components of that relationship, that imago connection, probably. And I started to write these scenes about them, and they were really alive in a way that the stuff that I was writing at Carville initially wasn't. I think it was just bogged down by this kind of preoccupation with authenticity, and this preoccupation with needing to get the details exactly right, which I still did. try as hard as possible in the fiction in this novel. But at especially initially, I was really kind of crushed by the weight of that. Um, and also, I found it really difficult to have the creative freedom that I needed, I think, to make those scenes really alive with my dad kind of breathing down my neck, essentially, right? So I would show him passages, and he would be really helpful in terms of helping me root out like historical inaccuracies, anachronisms, stuff like that. But he would also kind of correct any narrative or a perception that didn't match his own, that didn't match his own recollection. So there was this idea, I guess, that I needed for my dad to approve of it, essentially. And that was a problem. That's a huge issue creatively, right? And the
Yeah.
only way I could figure out eventually how to deal with that issue was to make it fiction. The other thing was the music in the book. I'm not a musician, and I couldn't find a way to research out of that, you know, if I was going to make my main character a musician. So the only way that I could get into that area of the novel was to do a writing exercise, where I tapped into my own experience as a young poet, I guess, when I discovered poetry as a teenager, what that felt like in my body, how I heard the music of the words. And I sort of transposed that into my character's experience of music. And it worked. Suddenly those bits of Victor's personality and character became really alive, whereas before they were quite flat. So that also told me that I needed to just like dive off the cliff into the ocean of fiction.
So you mentioned earlier that your father had given you permission
Mm.
to write about it. That this suggests that previously he did not give you his permission and you had asked. So I'm just curious about what changed.
Well, I hadn't actually asked because I never intended to write a book about this. It seemed like it just never occurred to me as something that he might ever want or that anyone would ever want to read, frankly. Um, the fact that he was at Carville, the fact that he'd had Hansen's disease, was a taboo. Like it was a taboo subject to speak of it outside of our home. It was very normal inside. My mother didn't like to talk about it, but he and I would talk about it frequently. But I knew enough to know that, I couldn't even talk about it to other family members. And I think it was such a secret that my grandparents didn't even tell some of my dad's siblings. My dad comes from a very large family, actually. So he has several siblings who were left behind in China when he and his brother came to the States. And he has several who were born in the States. And none of them, apart from his older brother who was in the States with him at the time, knew that he was at Carville or that he had had leprosy. My aunts and uncles thought that he was in the deep south for 9 years because he had asthma, which, is nuts because also the deep south was really bad for his asthma, first and foremost. But, the fact that they didn't question that narrative is really interesting. And it speaks to the power of denial, I think, and the power of suggestion. Um, yeah, but the permission element came from my dad's recovery from yet another illness. He had cancer in 2012 into 2013, and he's fully recovered. And, like the sort of enmeshed only child that I am, I brought him to my house and to live with me during his treatment, took him to every single appointment, et cetera, et cetera. So we were at his exit appointment with his surgeon, and my dad was talking to him about Hansen's disease and also about Carville. And we discovered that his surgeon had never heard about it before. never heard about Carville. He thought leprosy had been eradicated. Like it just like wasn't in his consciousness. And so, my dad and I walked out of that appointment thinking, wow, okay, so this might actually be a really important piece of medical history, if not American history, that people don't know about. And maybe it's important. And I think in talking to his doctors about it too, some of that taboo was lifted already. But I think based on that appointment, discovering that even a medical practitioner didn't know about this, really significant piece of history, that changed his view. And he said, if you want to write about this, you can. And then he helped me get all of that documentary um, archival stuff.
So, what is the current state of Hansen's disease in the world? It has not been eradicated. It still exists?
Yeah, it does still exist, actually, particularly in the global south. So it's kind of still somewhat of a problem in India. One of the real issues is that there's still so much stigma around leprosy that people don't go for treatment until it becomes quite severe. And so the more severe it is, the harder it is to treat. I was actually in conversation with the director of the Hanson's Clinic in Washington, connected to the University of Washington. And he was saying that that was still an issue too, even in the States, where people would not come forward for treatment. So, a surprising thing that's come out of this book is a kind of education and outreach component that I didn't think was in my lane, actually, but it seems that people are wanting me to talk about it because there's still so many misconceptions, I think, around Hanson's. And I think that part of the power of fiction is the ability to allow the reader to inhabit the interiority of characters, right? And that making forcing a reader to inhabit the interiority of lepers, is incredibly humanizing, right? It creates that identification.
Well, yeah, and that's something that the book does really well. And I think in particular because of the diversity of the place and the radical nature of the place, the integrated nature of the place in its time, to inhabit not just the Victor character, but a variety of characters from all these different backgrounds really brings that element of Carville to life in ways that a nonfiction account would probably have a much harder time doing.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good point.
You
Yeah.
know, I feel like unless you have access to historical records and firsthand accounts that are really robust, but like you said earlier, at least when it came to
Mhm.
Asian American residents at Carville, there wasn't much, right?
Right, that's right. I was able to find some oral histories given by people who were young at the time, like in the mid 50s, a handful. And some of them were relatively robust, but they were just kind of, anecdotes about what they would get up to, right? So I guess not robust enough to uh, do a legitimate history or, a legitimate piece of nonfiction around them. So that's a very good point. The ability to imagine oneself as a writer into these characters is one of the great things about fiction that I hadn't been able to access before in any other genre.
Well, and it also makes it more fun. I mean, you talk about struggling to write a nonfiction version of this book and feeling the weight of responsibility, this need to be authentic and to do justice to your father and his story and to this place and these people. I mean, I can imagine how I could easily psych myself out. And I think that there has to be an element of play and fun. And this can happen in fiction or non. You know, it's not like it's exclusive to fiction, but the point is that in the absence of that element, it's hard to sustain one's energies over the course of time that it takes to write a book. Right? I mean, if going to the keyboard every day is just like, oh boy, here we go, the weight of history's on my shoulders, like that's a tough slog, right? But
Yeah.
if you're going and you're interested in the story that you're telling and you're having some fun creating these characters, and there's an element of mystery in terms of what is going to happen because you have that level of freedom, It just makes a creative sense to me that that worked while the
Right.
other version didn't.
Right. Right. I guess I could have written a poetry collection about it, but it didn't come to me, like I feel like my muse is a bit of a feral cat, it comes and goes as it pleases. And it comes in many different forms as well. I work in multiple genres and I don't really choose what project is coming to me at any given time. In fact, after I began writing this book, my second poetry collection interrupted it. So, I went with that.
Feral cat showed up. I like that metaphor. Did your dad go to LSU?
No, no, he didn't. He went back to New York.
Oh, he did.
So,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So he went to Pace,
Okay. I was going to say, because like I'm trying to place him in time. What year was he born?
1937.
Oh, okay. So he's like a few years older than my parents, but they
I
would have
think if
been.
he'd stayed, he would have possibly gone to LSU.
And he left Carville at in 63.
Yes, so he would have been 25 when he left. And I think by that point he felt like he was too old for college, first of all. So he took some courses at Pace, but he didn't finish. Um, but, he also had a home to go back to, right? A
Right.
lot of his peers didn't. A lot of his peers were so estranged from their families that not only did they, not have a place to go after they were discharged, but they had also assumed different names, right? Like the majority of people, when they enter Carville, they pick a different name. But my dad never did, which is interesting. That kind of says something about who he is as a person as well. I think he's got a bit of oppositional energy to him.
I like your dad. He sounds like a good,
Me too.
sounds like good people. Uh, so that's so strange to think that my parents were, my mother especially grew up just like a few miles away
Yeah, that's
from,
crazy.
she was right down the road while all of this was happening. And after spending all this time writing this book, I imagine, you have your dad's blessing to write the story. I have to believe he's very proud of you and very proud of the book.
Yeah.
But in terms of like this mythological component to it and the way that you sort of carry this narrative with you through your childhood and through this dialogue with your father where he's telling you stories, this place has a kind of outsized spot in your imagination and it has all of this mystery and mythology to it. I'm curious to know what your relationship is to Carville and to this part of your family history now that you've gone through the process of writing a novel about it. Like, did it shrink it? Like, did you scratch the itch? Like how do you relate to it now?
I think I've integrated it. You know, it used to be this kind of, well, a secret first and foremost, but also just something that was disconnected from the rest of my life. It's interesting. A lot of the book is about dissociation and how people navigate that and the relationship between trauma and dissociation and how to reintegrate oneself. So I think in many ways Carville, the history of my family at Carville was dissociated from the rest of our life. And I think now it's been reintegrated. My father, I think, really enjoyed the novel version of this book far more than any sort of nonfiction. I think it allowed him to just relax into it. And yeah, so that would be the result.
Yeah, you both needed just a little bit of creative distance. That distance is key, like to have. I mean, I don't know. I feel like maybe reading a nonfiction account of a time like that in your life, I guess it could be interesting, but I can see how it would be more fun to read the novelized version.
Mm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
It's counterintuitive though, because in order to get close to it again, you have to create that distance, right? So
Right,
this kind
right.
of duality.
Well, I want to shift gears and I want to talk to you biographically about yourself, like separate from
Okay.
this mythological component. I'm always curious to know about the way that people come up as writers and like what leads them down
Mm.
this path. And I know from poking around a little bit that you were raised in Brooklyn. You're an only child, and grew up kind of working class, and you're the first person in your family to go to college. So I guess
That's right. Yeah.
my question about LSU was, it was needless, but you went to college, and this is where you kind of got the poetry bug. Is this right?
I got the poetry bug earlier. Actually, I got the poetry bug in high school. I was fortunate enough to go to like an arts high school in Brooklyn, where there was a really strong program around creative writing in addition to visual arts, etc. So, I discovered poetry as a pretty young person and started to publish pretty early, actually. So I won a couple of awards in high school. I won the Scholastic National Award for Writing, which I recently discovered now gives a $10,000 prize. That was not the case back then. It was just like a lunch.
Yeah.
But, and other couple of awards too. So that kind of gave me a misconception, I think, about what the industry was like and the how difficult or easy it actually was to enter it. I went to college then. I had to talk about distance. I had to cross the ocean to feel comfortable. I think in college I went to Cambridge University in the UK. And I continued to write there. And in my senior year, I published a poem in the Maze Anthology of Oxford and Cambridge, which is a literary journal that a lot of London agents will scout from. They look for new talent there. So by that point, I knew that poetry didn't make any money. So I wasn't expecting anything. But I went to the launch party, did a reading with the rest of my peers. And sure enough, I was actually approached by an agent, which blew my mind. And I was thrilled. Of course I would be. I was 22. I didn't know my ass from my elbow, and I was just so happy to be chosen. That I had no idea that I had a choice to make too. Right? Like the general wisdom is never go with the first guy that asks, and I totally did. I didn't know that I had the right to shop around. I didn't know that fit was important. I kind of treated him like a professor, I guess, rather than the business partner that he was supposed to be. He, of course, said, if you're going to work with me, we're not doing poetry. Can't sell that. So you can either try your hand at fiction or screenwriting. And I had done a lot of theater in college. I'd also made a few student films, and I'd worked as a production assistant in the summers in New York on a couple of movies. So I thought, okay, I'll try screenplay. So I came up with a screenplay, also a period piece, actually set in the 1970s in New York City, about a Chinese American photographer, a man. And that agent said, "Oh, well, this is unsellable. I don't think." And this is the late 90s. I don't think um, anyone will be able to connect with that character. You know, and I knew this for the subtle racism that it was, or maybe not so subtle. Maybe he was right though. I don't know. In terms of the market certainly was as racist then as it is now, and certainly more so, I guess, in the 1990s. So, you know, he said, okay, you can either revise the script or you can write me something else that I can actually sell. And I took this in such a way that, I thought, okay, I guess this means I'm not cut out for this business. I guess, that was a mistake. And, I never called him again. I didn't try to write another screenplay. I just turned around and went back to grad school. I was fortunate enough to have done well enough to, go back to Cambridge for grad school. I didn't even go back to the English department because I was so ashamed of myself. I was really humiliated by this experience. I internalized it as a personal failure. And I didn't want my professors to know that I'd crashed and burned. So I went to the sociology department instead, which is next door to the English department. And I stayed in academia for like over a decade, and didn't write another word creatively until my older daughter was born. in 2007.
That's what cracked it?
Yes. Yeah. I think there was something about that really, trippy time when you first become a parent. It's such an intense physical experience. I didn't sleep. My daughter was really colicky, and I didn't know what I was doing as a new parent, and so I didn't sleep for months and months. There was something about that, I think, that allowed my subconscious to bubble up and take over to an extent. I'd also started a meditation practice. Maybe that helped as well. But all of a sudden, I started dreaming really, really vividly, and I started to hear the music of the words a little bit. Although I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't recognize it at the time. But I just started to scribble down, bits and pieces of what I was thinking about, what I was hearing in my head, thinking, okay, I just want to keep a record of what was going on, what I was thinking about when my daughter was born. Um, Eventually, I took these bits and pieces and typed them up onto a Word document, and they kind of looked like poems or bits of poems. I started tinkering with them. I'm surprised I didn't freak out, but I think the stakes were so low by that point that, it didn't matter anymore. And so much time had passed, and I had no expectations around what would happen from them. But, I messed around with these bits and pieces, and eventually they became the poems that went into my first poetry collection, Turn, which didn't have, an easy time getting published. It was actually rejected more than 50 times before it found a publisher. But then that collection was a finalist for the Oregon Book Awards. So I guess it wasn't so bad after all. But,
Right.
one of the things that, you helped me do as the founding editor at the Nervous Breakdown was, take me on as a poetry editor. And having no MFA and having been out of the country for 15 years, that was what allowed me to begin to build community in the poetry world in the States, and also to just get a sense of what was happening in poetry over here. When you're out of the game, you don't really know how people are writing, what the trends are, I suppose. Although you don't want to follow trends necessarily, but whatever you write is going to be in conversation with whatever else is being written at that time. So it allowed me to join the conversation. So thank you for that, Brad.
Well, sure. Yeah. I didn't know all that backstory, to be honest with you. And I'm curious to know how you wound up at Cambridge. I mean, it's an excellent school, but
Yeah,
it's not the most typical path for a kid from Brooklyn to
yeah,
go across the pond and go to Cambridge. So what brought you there?
that's true. Well, I went to a prep school essentially that was arts oriented, and
What was
it
it? What
was
was it called?
Saint Anne's.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah,
I've had multiple guests on this show that went to St. Anne's.
I bet. Yeah, yeah. Produces a lot of writers for sure. So, it's a pretty hoity-toity school. And they knew about Cambridge and Oxford. But also, you know what? The reason why I decided to apply, and the, reason why I had the idea in the first place, was that my parents were close friends with a gay couple, Alan and David, when I was growing up. And, they were that sort of boomer generation of, buttoned up and very proper, gay men who liked the nicer things in life, So my Uncle David, I used to call him, Uncle David. They've both passed, sadly, but Uncle David was a PR man, and Uncle Alan was a painter, and he was a professor in the art department at the college, at the community college where my dad was a lab technician. So that's how they met. And my mother was running an art supply store in Brooklyn. So, she became really close friends with Alan. And then, as couples, they became friends with each other. And I was the child in their life. So they were very well traveled. They went to Europe every year, sometimes twice a year. So, they thought from the time that I was very little that I was very verbal, that I was, very interested in writing. They knew all about that. So they suggested that I perhaps consider going to college abroad, and specifically in the UK. So that's what gave me the seed that then became my higher education.
That's great. I mean, that sounds like a fabulous experience. I'm sure you probably, I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but I can imagine you probably look back fondly on it. And you could do worse, in terms of making choices.
Yeah, undergrad certainly. It had a kind of Hogwarts feel, certainly. But I think I think for me, coming from Brooklyn as, a young woman of color, there was a lot on me, right? And particularly coming from a working class background in a school that was primarily white and primarily far more wealthy than my family was. There was a lot of baggage, but for the first time in my life at Cambridge, the slate was wiped clean. I was just the American girl for the first time. And I think that afforded me a lot of freedom to explore who I really was. My identity and my artistic identity. I did a lot of theater, as I said, and that was something that I hadn't tried before, but realized that I had a certain facility with and found joy in. So it was a great experience, undergrad. In postgraduate, I think a lot of people run into this where they, see behind the curtain of the administration a little bit more, and you see all the politics and bitchery that happens back there. So that kind of turned me off a bit. And it's a more isolated
Bitchery.
experience. Bitchery, yes.
Wow. Well, I think there's a lot of lessons embedded in what you've just been saying, going all the way back to when you met this agent and, like you said, treated him like a professor rather than a business partner, and then internalized his treatment of you as shame, essentially,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
a personal failing, and how that stifled you creatively for a long time. And that, I'm sure you look back upon with some regret, right? To let that guy and that experience cause this to happen. I'm sure you probably think like, wow, I wish I would have just moved on more quickly, right, to the next thing.
Sure. I mean, for a long time, I thought, after I got back into writing, I sort of whipped myself as one does, and thought, I should have just gotten back on the horse. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to persist and keep going. But in retrospect, I don't actually regret my time studying sociology, because I think that comes into my work, my
I was going to
creative
say,
work.
yeah,
That the lens that I view the world with is very much rooted in ideas that I picked up as a sociologist, and that I think are very important. Reflexivity, the idea that words make worlds, and the idea of making the familiar strange. Right, like you take a received notion and you turn it around and examine it as if it were something crazy, right? Yeah, so I don't think it was a waste, actually, because I wouldn't have the voice as a writer that I have now had I not had this kind of circuitous, meandering route.
but you're back now in a creative mode. I mean, you've kind of shifted gears and have sort of shed the weight of whatever that first agent caused or led you to, and now you're back to writing regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know what the industry is like. It's a really tough place, right? And another thing that I suppose I don't regret now is having gone back into it with greater maturity. I was 22. I was a kid back then, and when we went on my second rodeo around finding an agent, I was in my mid 40s. So I'd you know lived enough life to develop not necessarily a thicker skin, but a greater sense of what my needs are, what my deal breakers are, how I work as a writer, and what I need in terms of feedback and creative communication and editorial communication. So, I think I was armed with a lot better tools this time around that I wouldn't have gotten without time.
Right. So, are you working on another project? I always ask people this. It's okay if you're not, but do you have another book in the works?
Yeah, I do. It's completely different. It's not a period piece, it's contemporary, and it's satirical comedy, and
Oh,
it's called MILF.
oh, okay.
So, yes. Yeah, so it's a bit of a family drama that's set during the pandemic, but it skewers everything from academia to marriage to certain artistic echelons of New York City and upstate New York where I now live. So yeah, I'm working
Is
on
it
that,
fun
trying to.
fun to work? I mean, shifting gears because this is, I mean, King of the Armadillos does have its moments of levity, but I wouldn't classify it as a comedic work or a satire, you know. So it's fun to shift gears. That's a pretty big shift in gears.
Yeah, I mean it's a bit of a surprise, I guess, to some people that I have a sense of humor, but I do, and that and that sense of humor is pretty filthy. So I get to let that rip here in this book. It's irreverent and erudite to a degree, but also raunchy. So
All right.
that's really fun.
Well, it's been fun talking with you, and congratulations on King of the Armadillos. And thank you for writing this book because, as strange as it may sound, it is like it illuminates a part of my own personal history, probably unexpectedly for you, that didn't. I don't think you had any idea coming into this conversation that I would have such close personal ties to this part of the country and to this story. But it's been a kind of mystery to me too, and this is the most I've ever been able to see inside that place. So I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Brad. I mean, you certainly blew my mind, but
I thought about telling you like before, but I was like, no, I'll just wait until we're kind of in conversation, and I'll drop the news. And it's a small world. So thank you.
Thank you.